It raised too many questions for me to learn when you're 25, your dad isn't your biological father, and also that he has no idea. The whole thing was tough for me to wrap my head around, especially considering how close I was to my dad and to my dad's whole family. I was offered this job to join the Obama campaign and just poured myself into it. And when you're a speechwriter in a presidential campaign, it's a great excuse not to focus on personal stuff. One of the lessons I've taken away from this whole experience is about there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma, and there's also such a thing as intergenerational healing.
Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Hello, dear family and friends. Today is the first day of fall 2020. I hope you are all doing well and looking forward to cooler temperatures and the change of the season. When I launched this podcast in the summer of 2019, I wanted to use it to share inspirational people's stories. I was hopeful and bright-eyed with big goals in mind to find common understanding and humanity, to celebrate our wonderfully complicated families, and to achieve mental wellness by ridding the stigma and the shame against mental illness. But I also wanted to show why family secrets can be so harmful in passing down generational trauma, and why shining a light on those dark family secrets is the surest path to wellness. Well, today's episode with Adam Frankel proves that point like no other. Thank you so much for subscribing and listening and sharing and writing those great 5-star reviews, and also for following me on all the social media platforms at Right Now Rachel. That's right with a W. Take care and enjoy. Adam Frankel's maternal grandparents survived the Holocaust and built new lives with new names in Connecticut. Although they tried to leave the horrors of their past behind, the pain they suffered crossed generational lines, a fact most apparent in the mental health of Adam's mother. When Adam sat down with her to examine their family history in detail, he learned another shocking secret. His beloved dad was not, in fact, his biological father, and no one knew. At just 25 years old, Adam was a senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama when he discovered he was only half of who he thought he was. This new knowledge created an identity crisis that Adam tried to push down, but it manifested in panic attacks because he couldn't speak to his dad about it for fear it would break his heart. Adam goes on a journey to define his family's bond and ultimately rewrites his family's story in truth to build a life for his own young family. In his book, The Survivors, A Story of War, Inheritance, and Healing, we come to see the nature of our family's traumas vary, but each of us is faced with the same choice. We can turn away from what we've inherited, or we can confront it in the hope of moving on and stopping that trauma from inflicting pain on future generations. Adam is a graduate of Princeton University and the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he was a Fulbright scholar. Currently, he is an advisor to Emerson Collective, a social change organization, and Fenway Strategies, the communication firm founded by John Favreau and Tommy Theater. Adam lives in Arlington, Virginia with his wife and 2 children. I know you're going to be inspired by Adam's thoughtfulness and intelligence. Welcome. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for inviting me on.
I first heard about your story from Dani Shapiro's podcast, Family Secrets. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to interview her. And I'm really grateful to Dani for reaching out to you on my behalf. I just want to give you a little interesting anecdote. 24 years after my grandfather jumped from his high-rise on Wilshire and Beverly Glen, I was let back into the apartment and I found his incomplete personal manuscript and a business manuscript of 50 years of real estate business. It was titled, ironically, The Survivor, because he had survived his father's, his brother's, and his wife's suicides. That means both my mom's parents died by suicide. Your book, which is called The Survivor, has a different meaning. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Because this is a podcast called Dear Family, I love starting out by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family.
I grew up in New York City, and on my mom's side, my grandparents are Holocaust survivors who came to this country after World War II. And my mom and her siblings were raised in Connecticut. She married my father in the 1970s. My dad's family had been here some time longer and lived in Westchester. And I was very close to both sets of grandparents growing up. My parents split when I was very young. And so I grew up very close to my grandparents. I now am a parent myself with two young children. And I realized I'm sure they wanted me to become close to their parents, but I also think it helped with childcare that when I was with these parents, they would bring me up to speed them. And so I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. In many ways, a very privileged kind of upbringing in New York City. I went to private school and had a lot of blessings that I'm very grateful for.
How old are your kids?
We have a 4.5-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son.
Wow. Social distancing is tough, but in a way, at least you're not starting kindergarten. I'm a former kindergarten teacher, so
okay. Yeah.
I love those ages. How adorable. Yeah. But you have your hands full. And you just moved, right?
We moved. We were in Brooklyn. We were right around the epicenter of the pandemic when things started to happen, right near one of the hospitals that the New York Times kept profiling as being overrun. We kept seeing a line growing outside that hospital every day. And so we got out, we rented a place outside the city as things were getting a little crazy. After a month of renting there, we decided, let's move down to Arlington, Virginia, which is where we are now, back to the kind of DC area where we met. A lot more space here. It turns out.
I love that.
Suburbia and kind of has its benefits in a time like this.
Especially with little kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, absolutely. And I read an article about you and your wife in the New York Times called "A Match Set Up in the White House." Your wife sounds very cool and very awesome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about her?
She is. She's amazing. Her name is Stephanie, and she has a PhD in public health and leads a research center devoted to figuring out what works and what doesn't work for improving the lives of adolescents around the world. She works at an organization called Population Council. That's what she's doing, buried in the data and the research and doing the research on how to help young people around the world.
Very cool. You are also a high achiever. You went to Princeton and London School of Economics, and you were a Fulbright scholar. And at 25 years old, you became Obama's speechwriter. You're now a senior advisor at Fenway, and you're also an advisor at Emerson Collective, which is a social change organization. You must not sleep much, especially with two little kids. Can you tell us what an average day looks like for you? And are you currently working on the Biden-Harris campaign?
I help various sorts of people. I help through Fenway, which is a communications firm, and through Emerson, I work on speeches and op-eds and communication strategy for various clients, philanthropists, business leaders, political folks, some celebrities, that sort of thing. And Fenway Strategies is supporting the campaign. And so I'm helping out in that capacity as well.
We're going to switch gears and talk about your book, which came out in 2019, and it's called Survivors, A Story of War, Inheritance, and Healing. I think I listened to it in a matter of 2 days. And every time my husband looked at me, I was in tears and very moved. He kept saying, "Are you okay?" Your story, it's really touching. When you set out to write your family's story and your family's history, originally it was going to be about your grandparents' survival of the Holocaust, which of course, the word survivor comes from. Mm-hmm. If you were to sum up the story, it's about intergenerational trauma that you can inherit. And a lot of that comes from family secrets. Let's start by talking about your first family secret, which was your family's last name.
My mother's name is Ellen Peresman. My middle name is Peresman, Perecman. And that is the name also of my grandparents. My grandfather, his name was George Peresman, and he had a watch repair shop in New Haven called Peresman Jewelers. This was our family name, the name that I grew up with, the name on government documents, etc. But it was not actually the name that he was born with. His true name was Gershon Gabursky, and he, like a lot of people, got a different name when he came to the United States. In his case, it wasn't a name that was given to him by immigration authorities who couldn't understand his accent, as often was the case. In his case, he bought papers for somebody else in a displaced persons camp in post-war Germany. He was always a little shady about the details of this. He never was really that forthcoming about it. But what I gleaned was that he was selling some items on the black market to make a little extra money after the war. And there was an arrest warrant out for him. And he was worried the arrest warrant would make it difficult for him to immigrate to the United States. And so he bought papers, and he was married to my grandmother at the time. So she bought papers for somebody else. And the two of them got remarried with false papers as a new wedded couple under another fake name. And they came to this country under that name of Parisman. But when I was growing up, this was a huge secret. When my mom was young, no one knew about it. The family didn't tell anybody. When I was young, I remember somebody calling up, going through the phone book, found another Parisman, called us up thinking they'd found a long lost family member. And we hung up the phone quickly. My mom was really afraid that somebody would catch on. There was a lot put on it. Looking at it now, I'm sort of like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, a lot of people have stories like this. I think for my grandfather, it was a big deal because he received reparations from the German government. And he received those reparations under this name. And the account that he provided to the German government to receive those reparations was the true account. Why we have the documents, we have the paperwork and everything in the archives of Yad Vashem and the Holocaust. It's a true experience, but the name was different. And I think he was worried that that would be an issue for the reparations payments. And so nobody ever spilled the secret. And I think when my book came out and shared that secret, old family friends learned it for the first time. And spilling that secret upset family members, which to me, I'm very proud of my grandfather. I think it speaks to his resourcefulness, his ability to reinvent himself, to survive, to make a way for his family. It fills me with awe, but other people have different reactions.
Your mom probably felt that secrecy without knowing it, and then she ended up holding a secret. And there's something to be said about not just the generational trauma, but the unspoken. I can relate to you growing up with an unstable mom because both our moms weren't diagnosed with mental health issues until later in life. My mom has bipolar and your mom has borderline personality disorder. Some of the other similarities that you and I both share is that our moms had multiple boyfriends and that growing up, there were times where it felt, or maybe even when we were out of the house, it felt like we were walking on eggshells and something could quickly trigger a mood swing. Looking back, it's very clear that the chaos was from a mental health issue. But growing up, you and I did not know that. I do think writing and talking about our family history really helps us find compassion for our moms and see mental health issues as a true disorder. I always felt like I had to parent my mom, and you called it a parentified child. I'd never heard of that. Can you tell us a little bit about that role? Did you resent it? Did you act on it?
That was one of the hardest parts of the book to write about, the dynamic with my mom. It makes me sad when I think about some aspects of my childhood. I mean, never really knowing as a little kid what version of her would be returning from work, whether it was someone who was sort of outgoing and wanted to spend time together, or whether she would just go into her room and shut the door. I was raised as an only child. And so it was just the two of us in that house. And so it was lonely at times. To her credit, when she read the book, she apologized for some of that stuff. There are things she should have rightly apologized for, but that's not one of them. I wouldn't ask her to apologize for her own mental health issues, but she did, and some of the effects that it had. And I think I just felt growing up like I had to be an anchor, the even-keeled one. I would always try and read her moods and make my own assessment of how severe a situation was. I knew I couldn't really trust her assessment. I knew that she would have these swings and have disproportionate responses. And I had to be the one to say, well, that's not really a proportional response emotionally to this. And so I could kind of detach myself a little and not really trust her emotions or my own, or any emotions, frankly. I think it made me kind of wary of emotions, seeing how quickly my mother could shift. This notion of a parentified child comes from the literature about the children of borderline mothers and the need to be that adult to grow up quickly and play that kind of stabilizing role in a family and in a household where things aren't really always that stable.
Now that you're raising your own kids, I'm sure some of that comes back, those memories. I know that happened with me. Another thing I could relate to in your coming of age portion of your story was how you wanted to attach yourself to one side of the family over the other. And it was your dad's side of the family, maybe because they had more means or more status. I had some of those feelings too. I think it's partly for me, it was growing up in the 80s and it was materialism and all of that. Now, in retrospect, you can look back and see how incredible your grandparents were.
I was very close to all of my grandparents growing up, but I definitely gravitated toward my father's parents. I think the reasons are probably not hard to understand for a young kid. My dad's parents, when I visit them, they take me to the country club. They'd buy me all these presents. They'd gone to good schools. My grandfather had been a speechwriter for presidential candidates and well-known progressives in the 20th century, from Adlai Stevenson to George McGovern, Hubert Humphrey, these sorts of folks. And I just really looked up to them and admired that. And my mom's parents, I revered their experience as Holocaust survivors. That was always a very sort of sacred thing to me and in our family. But it was different. They immigrated to this country in the 50s. They always had thick accents. I would sit for hours at a time in my grandfather's watch repair shop trying to pass the time. And when I wasn't there, we were at his house and just sort of sitting around watching TV while he repaired watches, sometimes talking to him too. But it was just a different experience for a young kid. Any young kid would probably gravitate toward the former. As I got older and began to reflect and reckon with my own family's experience, I began to see the kind of different ways in which they'd influenced me and shaped my own family journey.
With age and wisdom, you see the importance of all your grandparents. You're so lucky to have had them all in your life. Definitely.
Absolutely.
I love that you grew up not just wanting to be a writer, but wanting to be a presidential speechwriter. You had the incredible opportunity to ghost Ted Sorensen. And at 25 years old, you were offered this incredible opportunity to become Barack Obama's speechwriter. Talk about dreams come true. That is truly phenomenal. Yeah. It was also the same time you discovered that you weren't your father's biological son.
Yeah.
That's when you pushed yourself away from your mom. Totally understandable. I think anybody would feel some resentment. But you discuss how everyone in the Obama world was very open about their families and there were no secrets because you were with each other 24 hours, and yet you kept that secret. How did you concentrate? And did you have an identity crisis?
As you say, I learned right before joining the Obama campaign that my dad is not my biological father, and that this was a secret that my mom had kept, not just from me, but from my dad and from everybody. According to her, in that initial conversation or series of conversations I had with her, nobody knew about this secret except for now me, my mother, and my actual biological father. But my dad didn't know, and I was terrified of telling him, and it would be almost 10 years before I summoned the courage to actually talk to him about it. The way I dealt with it for almost that whole time was just by burying it. I couldn't deal with it. It was too upsetting. It raised too many questions for me to learn when you're 25, your dad isn't your biological father, and also that he has no idea. The whole thing was tough for me to wrap my head around, especially considering how close I was to my dad and to my dad's whole family. I was offered this job to join the Obama campaign and just poured myself into it. And when you're a speechwriter in a presidential campaign, it's a great excuse not to focus on personal stuff because you don't have time to. You're too busy. And that was in some ways very welcome for me because I didn't want to think about this stuff. Whenever I started thinking about it, it pulled me into a dark place. And so I just focused on my work for the duration of the campaign through the first term. It was only later on in the White House and when I left for the end of the first term that I really started grappling with all of this stuff and started going back to my mother and asking what had happened, asking questions. As I started grappling with it, I really did have an identity crisis. I did not know who I was. It had a profound impact on me. For a while, I lost my mooring. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I thought about things. It raised these profound existential questions for me. And I found myself having panic attacks. I was manifesting in all kinds of ways in my life. And that was how I knew I needed to actually confront it and head on and could no longer look away from it and bury it.
You didn't go to your dad because your mom told you it would break his heart. I could see why you would be upset with her because she was married to your dad at the time.
Yeah.
And she had an affair with your biological father, who you name as Jason Black. And he was a presence in your life for all these years. It's so understandable why you would need to cut yourself off from that. And that's the age when you are trying to figure out who you are separate from your family. So Jason was in your life. And when you did find out that, oh, this man that was always coming to my birthday parties and was giving me nice gifts, and you never really kind of understood why, probably at the time, or even maybe thought much about it. How did you feel about him once you found out? And did you want to get to know him more? Were you angry with him?
I grew up with him as like a sort of all frequent presence. We even took a vacation at his home that he owned in France one summer. But I hadn't been in touch with him in years when all of this stuff started to happen. I reached out to him and asked for a paternity test. And he came back with a sort of supremely confident answer that you'll get a positive result. So you should decide now if you want to know that for sure, if you'd rather be unsure. I proceeded and it came back positive. And I reached out again and we started having lunch every other month or something for a while. I just wanted to figure out what I thought of him in this new context. I didn't really know what I was looking for. I certainly wasn't looking for a dad. I love my dad and I already had a dad. I wanted to figure out what I thought of him in this whole situation. And I learned some things over the course of those conversations. He told me that I was a planned pregnancy. And so I went back to my mom and I said, Jason said you wanted to have me. Why did you want to have me? And my mom said, well, I wouldn't say it was my idea, so okay. So I go back to Jason and I say, why did you want to have me? And he said, the idea of having a secret baby appealed to my sense of mystery and the erotic. So,
a little narcissist. Would you call that narcissistic?
I couldn't even, honestly, I say that to you now.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
It's incomprehensible to me. What I mean? It's like a father of these two little kids. The whole situation is even more incomprehensible to me as a dad now.
Jason's married with kids, correct?
Oh, yeah. I know Jason is married. He has a few children. I was raised as an only child, but I actually have multiple half siblings, all of whom I've met in my life. And I also learned there was another pregnancy after me that never came to term.
Between your mom and Jason?
Yes. Oh. Which I can only interpret to mean that they were trying to deceive my dad into raising multiple ones of this guy's kids. I mean, the whole thing is just crazy. It was very hard for me, and it's still impossible for me to understand in every dimension, both from Jason's perspective and my mom's. Carrying this around, I've gone through this exercise where I imagine, what if Steph, my wife, or I were raising another person's child and trying to keep it a secret, like a mental baggage and weight of trying to, what is happening?
I just interviewed Danny Shapiro. She said that 2% of people that take DNA tests get a result that's NPE, which stands for not parent expected. Right. In this day and age, I think people realize you cannot keep that a family secret anymore. Totally. Your mom struggled with depression and mental health issues her whole life. When you found out about your paternity, she pleaded with you to go to a therapist to repair your relationship. Instead, you stopped speaking to her for a while, which led her to have a further breakdown. I can see why one would do that. And believe me, I wanted to stop speaking to my mom on multiple occasions. She's done things in my life that I wanted to push her away. But knowing that both of her parents took their lives, I was always so afraid.
I did withdraw from her and stop speaking to her. And she had an episode that was very scary and called me up, and I found her in a condition in our house that I've never seen her in. I called her brother and we rushed her to the psychiatric emergency room. She started coming back to us slowly that day, and she wasn't admitted. She came back home, and it was at that point that she pleaded with me to see a therapist. And I did go with her because, as you say about your own mother, I was worried about her safety at that point. The reason I called her brother and we rushed her to the psychiatric ER was because I thought she was going to try and take her own life. She'd been hospitalized for a suicide attempt before I was born. And so I'd never seen her in a state like that, and I was terrified. I went with her to a therapist more than once. Frankly, I didn't want to be there, but I was really worried about her, and I felt some obligation to show her I wasn't totally withdrawing, that I still loved her.
The guilt that gets put on kids whose parents have mental health issues to feel like they always need to
Yeah.
be the caretaker. Your mom may have biological markers to have mental health issues, but there's also what she inherited as far as the trauma coming down the family line, because your mother's father, so this is your biological grandfather, he was in various concentration camps, ending in Dachau, and your mom's mom, your maternal grandmother, hid out in the woods during most of the war with the Jewish resistance, which, by the way, I think is kind of badass. I mean,
Totally badass.
like to imagine a woman like just
badass. Yes.
That's awesome, but also sad, of course. Your mom also had to keep this a secret for all these years. That has to eat at her.
When I confronted her on the secret, she would say, well, what do you expect? I was raised not to share our family name. Those were her words to me. What do you expect? This is how I was raised. Her siblings would take issue with that. Her siblings would say, what are you talking about? But that's my mom's perspective. And I see the through line of the family secrets there. It's very clear to me.
When you finally did tell your dad the truth, I could just feel your relief and your sadness. And there are no spoilers because it's really about the people and the stories. So I'm not giving anything away. But can you tell us about what that felt like to release that secret and get that off your chest, and how your dad reacted?
It's sort of indescribable. When you go around carrying a secret from your own father for 10 years, you forget over time the impact that secret has had on you. I'd have nightmares for a while. I had chronic panic attacks. I'd have effects that carrying around a secret like that has on you, and just sort of ways in which it alters and distorts your relationship or relationships. The only path through the secret was to talk to my dad about it. And my biggest regret, I guess I'd say, in this whole process was not coming to him sooner. I should have trusted in his love. I would have spared myself a lot of heartache. When my mom first told me the secret, I asked if dad knew, and she said, no, it would break his heart. And I was sure that she was right. Having that conversation opened the door and opened everything up. And my dad and I are closer now than we've ever been in my whole life. We've got a beautiful, wonderful relationship. Writing this book, both my parents were wary about it for maybe obvious, but also different reasons. And my dad was wary about it because this whole saga was embarrassing and mortifying in terms of how conventionally men see themselves and their roles sort of emasculated. The whole thing, what Jason did to him and to my family and to me and to all of us, frankly, and also to my mother, it brought up a lot of painful stuff from his life that he was happy to have moved beyond. Over the course of reading it and seeing people's reactions, what he realized, which is what I knew would happen, is that people would come to him and applaud him as being an extraordinary father, which is what I knew would be the result, because he is. I said to him, Dad, you're the hero of the book, because his response to me was pure love. I knew this was a possibility, Adam, and I thought about it a long time ago. I decided it doesn't make a difference one way or another. You're my son. I could get choked up now just thinking about that. People have responded on that human level to him in reading the book.
There's so many lessons to be learned from your story. And one is that the shame that everyone felt from keeping it was actually just so much more dangerous than the truth. And if you come from a good place, love will save you. Also, the idea that family does not need to be biological, that's important for maybe step parents or whoever's listening that is not a biological parent. You can be just as close.
Family is built on love. That's the fundamental truth of my own experience and journey.
Right. Oh, and I'm sure your kids are receiving tons of love from you and your wife.
So.
You talk about Rachel Yehuda's work at Mount Sinai in regards to studying traumatic stress, and all kinds of generational trauma can ripple down the family line. And that's partly why I decided to write and podcast, is because I wanted to stop the generational trauma from getting to my daughters. Ours are mental health issues and suicide, and yours were the anxiety that come from Holocaust. I heard you on a PBS interview mentioning how other things can get passed down, like post-traumatic slavery syndrome due to racism and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and the soul wound when it comes to genocide in Native American communities. I find it so interesting, the study of epigenetics and how Holocaust survivors are 3 times more likely to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you give us a little insight on how trauma left a genetic impact on your mom?
It's a big question. There's no doubt that trauma can be passed on from generation to generation. The examples you cited are just a few. The different physiological ailments that plague Black Americans versus white Americans, some of that can be attributed to chronic generational trauma of racism, other kind of societal manifestations of that racism in the way communities are built, where pollutants are dispersed, all kinds of things. The soul wound in the Native American community that you referenced refers to the legacy of the genocide and its manifestation in all kinds of health and social ills that have plagued Native populations. Recently was talking with students in Rwanda, their whole country that is reeling from a profound trauma, and they're much closer to it than I am. I was talking to students who are in their 20s, and the way they're talking makes me think of my mother, who's the second generation from the Holocaust. They're a generation behind there. We were having a conversation about that across generations, but it felt very familiar to me what they were saying, the kinds of things I've heard my mother say. We know a number of things about trauma. The field of epigenetics is an emerging science. And essentially what it boils down to is the epigenome is a layer of information that sits on top of the cell, and it receives information that can be influenced by external factors in your environment. And that includes stress. You were referencing children of Holocaust survivors are 3 times as likely to display PTSD when confronted by a traumatic event as demographically similar Jews who are not children of Holocaust survivors. That's a finding that Rachel Yehuda found. She also found that babies born to mothers who were at or near ground zero on 9/11 and pregnant had low levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone that's associated with PTSD. And we can see this across generations. Children from Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed greater fear of radiation exposure and other things after the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. So we see this across generations. There's a lot of debate about how it gets passed down, the actual mechanisms, and whether it's directly inherited or whether it is passed on in some other way by the behaviors of a parent or something else. And we don't know the answer to that. It takes 4 generations to prove epigenetic inheritance. It is still a very new science, but the overarching lesson, as Rachel Yehuda puts it, is that we are works in progress, and our own experience and life choices are interacting with our DNA in ways that are changing us at the molecular level and making us new people. One of the lessons I've taken away from this whole experience is about there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma, and there's also such a thing as intergenerational healing. And why you're doing this podcast and why you're writing, I think when we do take these steps to confront it, we are contributing to intergenerational healing and making sure that we are stopping that trauma from being passed on to our own children.
Absolutely. And when you were talking about how you were experiencing panic attacks when you were holding on to that secret, I'm constantly reminding people how close your mental health is with your physical health and how stress can really manifest in physical maladies. By you writing your book and sharing your story, you're definitely cutting that line. So that's really good for your kids.
No, I'm trying. And it's important also for listeners to know there's somebody named James Pennebaker at UT Austin who's done research in what he calls expressive writing. And essentially what expressive writing is just writing about the thoughts and feelings that are weighing on you. And what they've shown through rigorous data and analysis is it can have a profound impact on your physical health. They've shown that expressive writing can mitigate and lessen the symptoms of certain forms of cancer. Just the act of writing, even for people who aren't professional writers, can really be an important tool for managing trauma and stress.
It saved me in my relationship with my mom. I would love to learn more about the cancer research. That's fascinating. Yeah, I'm happy for you that you've been able to unburden yourself from those secrets because they can feel so disruptive and difficult. Out of curiosity, as the grandson of Holocaust survivors, do you feel the need to pass on the religious practices to your children, or is it more the traditions that you might discuss?
I'm still on a journey with that one. I'm sort of a lapsed Jew myself. I was raised in a conservative tradition. My grandfather, my Zeta, considered himself not that religious compared to what he was in his own youth. But he was, in America, what passed for Orthodox. In his own words, he wasn't nearly as religious after the war as he was before. I was raised with kosher household and all this kind of stuff. And I've kind of drifted away. It is very important for my children to know their great-grandparents' story and what they endured because of their faith, and that they draw lessons from that about how to live their own lives. And whether one of those lessons needs to be observing the rites of Judaism, I haven't really landed firmly on that one. They're still young enough that I need to make a decision on that soon, but it's okay right now.
We grapple with it too. My husband's mom escaped Germany, comes from a line of rabbis, and my mom grew up with a Christmas tree. And I thought when I did my DNA test that I would not be 99% Ashkenazi, which I am. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Totally.
Definitely. Last two questions I ask all my guests. When you were 20, you were at Princeton. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
If you could write your younger 20-year-old self a Dear Adam love letter, knowing what you know now, what would it say?
Man, I think it would say, don't worry, it's going to be okay. You're about to feel like everything's going just great for you, and then feel like you're kind of walking over a cliff here when your whole world is about to be turned upside down, but you're going to be fine. And also tell your dad. Don't hide the secret.
I love that. And what do you do that brings you happiness? Do you have any happiness habits, things that bring you a lot of joy?
The quarantine universe has kind of restricted that. Honestly, the things that bring me the most joy these days are running up and giving my children hugs in the middle of the day. We spend a lot more time together because we're all working in the same house now. And I'd say far and away, the biggest source of joy these days is sneaking in hugs when I can throughout the day.
That's a good silver lining. I'm trying to remind myself of that too, because I have a senior that didn't get to go back to school, and I keep looking for all of those silver linings. Well, Adam, I will have links to your book in my show notes. And thank you so much. It truly was a pleasure and an honor to have this opportunity to speak with you.
I really
appreciate it. Okay. Take care, Adam.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, dear family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.